Hey there, it's Ray. In my last video I talked about obedience and this is part 2 to that video, so if you haven't already seen it I would recommend checking it out. I talked about a Milgram study that showed us that we do obey to authority figures even if it means hurting someone else. And in this video I am going to diverge a little bit away from what you'd find in everyday student textbooks, but I am going to talk about some topics that are covered in that, so if you're a student this could also be helpful. But if you want to get a more in-depth view of obedience, this video will also be for you. Those of you who saw the last video, you saw that we will obey to what someone tells us. And this showed us so much information, especially about the Holocaust, and about why so much bad stuff happens, and why people will do stuff that you wouldn't normally expect humans to do. It also showed us that we will also obey in other everyday occurrences. And while it showed us that we will do it, it didn't really say why. But it has inspired some other researchers to look at that topic and to understand why we would obey and what factors can affect how far we'll go. Last time we spoke of some situational factors that can affect the level we'll obey, like location, uniform, things like that. Anything that can devalue legitimate authority or anything that will give us social support will make us less likely to obey. However, there are also some dispositional factors, which are basically factors that are within us, so our personality, not the environment. In the introduction of his study in 1963, Milgram wrote this: "Obedience as a determinant of behaviour is of particular relevance in our time. Gas chambers were built, death camps were guarded, daily quotas of corpses were produced. These inhuman policies may have originated in the mind of a single person, but they could only be carried out on a massive scale if a very large number of persons obeyed orders." Though the term didn't quite exist back then, Milgram was talking about the term that we now know as situationalism. The idea that behaviour is largely determined by what is happening around us. And Milgram actually outlined this idea more in his agency theory. This is a psychological factor as to why we'll obey, and he said that we have two states that we're constantly in. We're in the autonomous state, which means that we're free to have our own beliefs, we're free to control our own behaviours, and whatever consequences we get from them are on us. We take the consequences for our own actions. But there's also the agency theory, which is that what we do is controlled by others and we don't accept those consequences, someone else will. Milgram believed that obedience to the structure of authority is due to how much responsibility we have. And what happens is we have this agentic shift from the autonomous state to the agency state, and it's basically the idea that we become an agent of someone else. So we're not acting on ourselves, we're just following orders. But there are things that need to be in place for this shift to happen. One, we need to believe that the person giving us the orders are of legitimate authority and they know what they're doing in the situation, more so than we know, and we believe that they are qualified to tell us what to do. But we also need to know that they will take responsibility for anything that happens afterwards, and if we don't believe that, we're less likely to obey because we can't really go into the agentic shift because we'll be taking the responsibility for the actions we do. Due to a social hierarchy, there is usually a leader in every single group we are in. So we shift from autonomy to agency, but that doesn't mean that we're unfeeling puppets and we don't feel bad for what we're doing. As you saw in Milgram's study, a lot of people were very distressed by the fact that they were shocking other people, yet they carried on. During the agentic shift, we feel bad for our actions. We feel high anxiety and moral strain, but feel powerless to actually stop. But there are binding factors that can make people ignore this feeling. So some people believe that the victim caused it themselves and that it's their fault they're in the situation. So we talk about the Milgram study, we might think, well, they volunteered to be a part of the study. If they hadn't volunteered, they wouldn't be getting shocked right now, so it's their fault. Or we deny that any damage is actually being caused. However, something we need to keep in mind about this idea that obedience is beyond our control and we don't mean to do it is something called the obedience alibi. So if even just wearing a uniform can make you kill someone, that means you have an excuse for being a bad person. David Mandel in 1988 said it was just an excuse or an alibi for bad behaviours to occur. And he argued that it's offensive to Holocaust survivors to say Nazis weren't bad people, just had to do it and they had no control over their actions. it was all down to one person telling them what to do. As I'm not Jewish myself, I will not go more into this matter because I don't feel like it's my place to talk about Holocaust survivors. This is just the psychological knowledge that I know from an outsider. So now we've talked about situational factors, you may be wondering, okay, so why doesn't everyone obey? Why were there some Nazi soldiers that refused to kill people? If we go back to the Holocaust, Klaus Hornik was a Nazi soldier who wouldn't kill any prisoners. He disobeyed any orders he was given to kill them. And you may be wondering, why would he do that, considering he had the same social pressures as all the other soldiers there that were actually doing it? And Hornig was punished for this. He wasn't killed for disobeying orders, but he was beaten, stripped of rank, and all this other stuff happened to him, yet he still didn't obey. He even screamed at other soldiers who were doing it and told them to stop. And we got to think, why could he disobey that much when the others couldn't? Personality type that may explain why some people are more likely to obey authority figures than others, and this is called the Authoritarian Personality. Adorno et al. Investigated the cases of the Authoritarian Personality in 2,000 white Americans, and he did this by measuring their unconscious attitude towards different racial groups using the F scale known as the fascist scale. There are several scales that are used to measure the authoritarian personality, but the F scale is the most well known and the most used. People with authoritarian leanings, i.e. those who scored higher on the F scale, identified with strong people and were very consumed with this idea of status, and saw those of higher status as deserving of respect, and those of lower status not deserving of it. It was seen that people with this personality type were more likely to be prejudiced to different racial groups and different social groups. It's said to have been originated from childhood, and it comes from strict and harsh parenting, and it's the idea of they're being belittled in childhood and they can't do anything about it because their parents are of higher authority to them. So then when they grow up, they respect higher authority, but they still have this resentment and hostility from the way they were brought up that they have to release it on someone. So they release it on the weaker people in society, which to them are those who are below them in terms of status. So this should mean that the Adolf Eichmanns of the world were just brought up badly in childhood and harshly and had this authoritarian personality, right? I really wish psychology were this easy, because that would make everything just, I could be like, yeah, that's it, end of the video, but unfortunately not. At the very least, it helps explain why some people are more prejudiced towards others and are more resistant to changing those prejudiced views. However, there isn't a lot of explanation for the personality type, and whilst a lot of pre-war Germany were racist, anti-Semitic, and all the other factors that do seem like authoritarian personality, it's highly unlikely that they all possessed the authoritarian personality. Social identity theory, however, could explain this a lot better than the personality types, as this is the idea that we identify with people that we're similar to and discriminate against those that we're not. Now we've spoken a lot about Germany and World War II, I'm going to diverge a little bit away from this and a little bit away from Milgram's original study and talk about Hoffling, because he actually took Milgram's study and put it into real life. This happened in 1966, and he tested on 22 real-life nurses, so they were the participants. He called up 22 nurses on 22 different occasions claiming to be a doctor, and asked if they had this medication in, and the medication clearly said the maximum dosage was 10 milligrams. But he asked them to administer 20 milligrams of the drug, so double the dosage, to his patient, and that he was in a rush but would sign the forms after the drug was administered. The nurses would have had to break 3 rules to obey to this order: accepting a phone instruction, giving double the dosage, and using an unauthorized medication. Despite this, 21 out of 22 of the nurses administered a drug to the patient, which luckily was a placebo, so the patient was unharmed. I got a comment on my Facebook page after someone shared the link to this video, and they answered no to whether or not they would harm a person. And I thought that was a very interesting answer. It was just a blunt no, like no context. And I feel like a lot of you would probably think that you wouldn't do this either. But when Hoffling asked a control group of 22 different nurses, 21 said they wouldn't administer the drug. Yet in real life, when that task is given to you, It's the complete opposite way around. So it's just very interesting to see what you think you'd do compared to what would actually happen. You could also say that maybe the reason why so many people obey is because these studies are so old now and people have changed. Like the new generation might be less likely to do this than the older generation, which is why I'm bringing this study to attention. In the late noughties, a psychologist called Berger actually recreated Milgram's study, which has been impossible due to the fact it's so unethical that we're not actually allowed to do the study again, but Berger found a way around it. He did this by, instead of what Milgram did and made his participants believe that they seriously harmed or killed someone by making them go to 450 volts, Berger ended the study at 150 volts. He did the study as many people said that, well, that was back in the 60s and we should be more aware and not just blindly obey anymore. But it turns out people haven't changed at all. At the end of the study, Berger was left with the same obedience rate as Milgram was, which shows that we're just as likely to harm a person today as we were back in the 60s. This proves that not only was Milgram's work accurate, but it could be more relevant now than ever. So what do you think? And do you have any other theories why you think people would obey? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe for more psychology content, and I'll see you all soon.